recession, higher unemployment and so on. And if we look at expenses in those years of the global financial crisis, 2009 to 2011, these recent years, you see there that, and this is estimate of the effect of the recession on those expenses, you see there that there's been quite a considerable increase, up to 1.2 billion on this estimate in those benefit expenses, and only 30 to 40% of that is an unemployment benefit. Sickness benefit, domestic purposes benefit and accommodation supplement all increased quite considerably over that period. So an exception for unemployment benefit is likely to be quite inadequate. The second area of specific problems with the cap is that all simple rules are open to game playing. And I'll leave you to read that list I've got there, but they range from simple cheating through to shifting responsibilities to local government and privatisation, very often for all the worst reasons. You could add to that list quite indefinitely, I think. It's simply up to human ingenuity how to get around such rules. And even if you agree with some of these measures, this is a pretty poor rationale in that for them, and they're likely to be badly executed. The response to this is to have increasing controls over what governments do to stop them avoiding the cap. So you end up with a list of increasing controls and a growing list of exemptions, or earmarking as they call it in the United States, particularly in the States there. Some variants require referendums for change or even embedded in the Constitution, but it ends up with complex, inflexible and distorted decision making. So I'll finish here on the underlying rationale. Rationales for smaller government and choice of revenue and spending rest on arguments around GDP growth. But GDP growth is just one indicator of the well-being of a nation, and not a very accurate one. The Treasury Living Standards project that it's currently developing acknowledges that there are multiple contributors to living standards, or to a more general measure of well-being. And they list economic growth, sustainability, equity, social capital, and reducing macroeconomic vulnerability. I must say that only Treasury would think of that last one as one of their great aims in life. Even if you don't accept this exact framework, the multidimensionality of it is absolutely correct. Democratic process is also vital in this whole area. Electors have the right to elect a government to increase as well as to reduce spending and the size of government. The government, once elected, then has the right to carry that out. And referendums and those other measures are a blunt and inflexible substitute for a government being able to carry out these things in a sensible way. In the end, the valid aim of fiscal sustainability depends on acceptance of the underlying rationale. A cap can't be legislated, put into a hard form without undermining the ability of electors to require change. So in conclusion, I've got no quarrel with wanting good quality spending and revenue collection. The question is, how do we encourage scrutiny that doesn't hog-tie governments or act as a Trojan horse for ideology? Amongst that must be to establish a broader framework of policy objectives, not just GDP growth. We need more open and more evidence-based analysis of policies. And we need, of course, improved tools for evaluating fiscal sustainability. Not an easy task, given that we know economic forecasting is a difficult business at the best of times. But a spending cap is simplistic, damaging, and will not resolve the underlying problems of obtaining good government. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Now, I didn't tell you at the start that we deliberately did not allow the two speakers to see each other's presentations before they gave them. It seemed a little unfair to let them have the chance to, as it were, counter-argue the other one before the first one even gets a chance to make the point. But we did allow Anne-Marie, to the extent that she had any time, given the short time space available, to see the two presentations. But more importantly, we wanted Anne-Marie to spark some discussion for us by being able to ask which of these two extremes Where are the good points that we should take from these two extremes? Where are the bad points that we perhaps should ignore? So I shall pass over to Anne-Marie, who will take us through some questions. She's only got 10 minutes, unfortunately, so you might hear the bell a bit sooner.
Thank you, that was great. I'm sure at least some of you have flip-flopped a bit between the two sides. I'm sure many of you haven't as well, because both presenters have made some excellent points. So my job is to help position this debate within a broader context. And to do that, I'd like to start by highlighting the common ground between the two presenters, of which there is quite a bit. Second, I'd like to talk a bit about fiscal rules and how New Zealand's fiscal policy framework fits within that context. And finally, I'd like us to muse a little bit on one of my favourite Yogi Berra quotes: "If you don't know where you're going, you might end up someplace else." As this quote might suggest, I think the main weakness of both presenters is that they haven't made clear where their prescription for fiscal policy is going, and that makes me slightly nervous. But I'll get to that later. Let me first start by identifying the common ground. Both presenters agree that it is a bad thing if a temporary boost in tax revenues during an economic upswing becomes locked into permanently higher structural spending commitments. And both agree that this, which we call fiscal policy pro-cyclicality, happened to some extent during the past decade. Not only that, but both presenters also agree that the quality of both public spending and tax collection is critical. That's great, because I agree wholeheartedly with both of them. So let's celebrate that common ground and move on to some broader discussion about fiscal rules. The economics literature on fiscal rules is pretty big. If you delve into it, you will come across all sorts of rules. There's debt rules, balanced budget rules, surplus rules, cyclically adjusted rules, spending caps, rules that impose penance if you slip up, and rules that forgive you for your transgressions. In comparing these rules, one of the main lessons that you find in the literature is, first of all, that no fiscal rule is optimal for all countries, and secondly, that all fiscal rules have shortcomings. So what sort of fiscal rule does New Zealand have? Well, the short answer is none. If you define a fiscal rule as some kind of mandatory numerical fiscal target. Instead, what we have is a transparency-based fiscal policy framework, which dates back to Ruth Richardson's Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is now part of the Public Finance Act. At the time the Act was being designed, more than 20 years ago, mandatory numerical fiscal targets were considered, but they were rejected in favour of 5 principles of responsible fiscal management. Basically what this means is that New Zealand governments have constrained discretion in their fiscal strategy setting. As long as their fiscal strategy is consistent with the principles of responsible fiscal management, they can pretty much do whatever they want. But these principles do constrain them, as they include things like including that debt is reduced to and maintained at a prudent level, ensuring that government net worth is maintained at a level that provides a buffer against risk, and so forth. Because of the prudent debt target part, our fiscal framework is often described as incorporating a debt rule, although the numerical part, the numerical level of that target is not prescribed in the legislation. Importantly, the Act also provides for some of the best public sector accountancy standards and reporting requirements in the world, which is very important because it makes New Zealand makes it almost very difficult for New Zealand governments to do any sort of accounting trickery to hide the true state of the books. In a sense, I like to think about New Zealand's fiscal framework as being a bit like my dad's approach to curfews. When I was a teenager, my best friend's dad gave her a curfew of 11 p.m. Midnight time sometimes, if she pleaded and if she did a lot of chores around the house. My dad used to get me to impose my own curfew. I could say I was going to be home at 11 or 12, sometimes even 1. This is a while ago now, and parties didn't go very late back then. But the point is that whatever I said, within some kind of grounds of reasonableness, would be fine, but I knew that I would be in deep trouble if I breached my own curfew. But of course, since I had said it myself, I had less reason to breach it. This is the same general principle of the Public Finance Act. While it doesn't contain any mandatory numerical targets, it does encourage political buy-in to fiscal responsibility, which is a lot more than you can say for a lot of European governments' attitudes to the more numerical fiscal rules that were embedded in the Stability and Growth Pact, just to give one example. This basically takes us to the essence of today's debate. Is our existing fiscal framework good enough? Or would we be better off with adding, on top of what we've already got, some kind of mandatory numerical fiscal rule, of which a cap on real per capita government spending is just one example? Now, just so you don't think I'm being biased here, I would like to point out that just because my dad's approach to curfews worked on me, that doesn't mean it would be best for all teenagers. The regime requires a certain amount of trust. I have no doubt that there are some kids who would take too much advantage of the flexibility on offer and who might be better off with something stricter. So to repeat again, no fiscal rule is optimal for all countries, and no fiscal rule is without shortcomings. Moving on to my final point, encapsulated by Yogi Berra. If you don't know where you're going, you might end up someplace else. Let's consider with where Bryce would like to take us with the specific fiscal rule being debated today. Government core Crown expenses are currently around $15,000 per head of population. This rule would allow the spending to increase with inflation and in line with population growth, but not in line with productivity growth. So government spending would shrink as a percent of GDP. No doubt some shrinkage may be a good thing in the minds of many of you. By forcing ongoing spending restraint, this rule may help to drive productivity gains within the state sector and ongoing reprioritisation of ineffective spending. These would be good things. It could also help to avoid pro-cyclical fiscal policy, but this is by no means guaranteed, given that the rule does not control tax policy changes and capital spending. But if left untouched for long enough, the rule would eventually result in government spending becoming very small as a share of GDP. One projection I have seen suggests that government spending would fall from over 30% of GDP now, it's just slightly over 30% now, to well under 20% of GDP by 2050. The process of that degree of shrinkage would create significant incentives for gaming behaviour to circumvent the rule, especially given the ageing of the population over that time period, which tends to put significant upward pressure on government spending per capita. But it's also not clear where Bill would have us go. Part of the reason he doesn't like this rule is because he puts a higher value than Bryce does on many areas of government spending. But too much faith in the value of government spending can lead to a bloated government, inefficiencies, and more examples of the sort of fiscal policy pro-cyclicality that we saw over the past decade. So I would like to hear from Bill how he thinks we can best guard against these fiscal risks. Does he think that the current fiscal policy framework is sufficient? If not, would he advocate some other fiscal rule? Does he support the idea of tweaking the existing fiscal transparency-based framework, as the government has said they plan to do, by introducing some new principles of responsible fiscal management and reporting requirements relating to the impact of fiscal policy on monetary policy and the need to manage public resources efficiently and effectively? Would this alone be enough? So that's all from me. I'll look forward to the rest of the debate.